The restaurant hummed softly with jazz and the clink of silverware. Naomi Carter stepped inside, her tailored blazer sharp against the muted tones of the room. Conversations faltered briefly as diners glanced at her, then quickly turned away. Ethan. Blake stood at the host stand, his smile fading as he noticed her. Adjusting his tie, he asked curtly, "Reservation?" "No," Naomi replied calmly. "Just one for dinner." Ethan's gaze flicked to the half-empty dining room before tightening his posture. "I'm afraid we're fully booked tonight," he said smoothly. Naomi's eyes didn't waver. "I'll wait," she said simply. Ethan Blake's smile tightened as Naomi Carter stood before him. His eyes flicked over her blazer and heels, searching for something to disqualify her presence. "Reservation?" he asked, his tone polite but sharp. "No," Naomi replied, her voice steady. "Just one for dinner." Ethan hesitated, glancing at the seating chart unnecessarily. The dining room behind him was half empty, but he didn't offer her a table. Instead, his posture stiffened and his smile faded entirely. "I'm afraid we're fully booked tonight," he said smoothly, his words carrying an edge that wasn't there moments ago. Naomi remained composed. Ethan leaned slightly forward, his polished shoes tapping faintly against the floor as he gestured toward the dining room. "We have policies here," he said coolly, his tone growing colder with each word. Naomi glanced at the empty tables behind him. "Those look available," she said quietly, her gaze unwavering. "They're reserved," Ethan replied quickly, his voice sharper now. Perhaps another establishment would be more suitable. Naomi didn't flinch. Her hands rested lightly on her purse strap as she tilted her head slightly. "I'll wait," she said simply, her calmness unsettling. Ethan, more than he expected. Nearby diners glanced at Naomi, their eyes lingering briefly before darting away. A woman in pearls leaned toward her companion, whispering, "Should we say something?" Her companion shook his head, focusing on his wine. Silverware clinked softly, the sound amplifying the room's heavy silence. Ethan straightened his tie, emboldened by their indifference. Naomi sat calmly, her hands resting on the table. The woman's question hung unanswered, swallowed by the ambient jazz and the unspoken rule. "Don't get involved. I'd like a menu, please," Naomi repeated, her voice steady. Ethan's smirk widened as he crossed his arms. "Policy requires reservations," he said coldly, though no such policy existed. Naomi's composure didn't waver. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze locking onto his. "I'll wait," she said again, her calmness unnerving him. Ethan scoffed, turning to walk away. "Suit yourself," he muttered, his arrogance masking his growing unease. The diners watched silently, their meals forgotten as tension thickened the air. Naomi leaned back in her chair, her tone soft but cutting through the silence. "Are you sure about this?" Ethan froze mid-step, his back to her. He turned slowly, forcing a smirk. "Absolutely," he said, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. The room seemed to hold its breath. A diner's fork hovered above their plate. Ethan's fingers twitched at his side, but he held his ground, convinced his authority was unshakable. Naomi's calm defiance lingered like a challenge he couldn't quite dismiss. Ethan's laugh was brittle. "Policy is policy," he snapped, gesturing vaguely toward the door. "You're wasting your time." Naomi didn't blink. "Time well spent," she replied evenly. His jaw tightened. "This isn't a diner," he hissed, leaning closer. "We have standards." Naomi's phone buzzed on the table. Ethan's eyes flicked to it, a flicker of doubt crossing his face before he smothered it with a sneer. "Expecting backup?" She said nothing, her silence louder than his bluster. Naomi's phone lit up. Ownership transfer confirmed. She tilted the screen toward Ethan, her expression unreadable. "What's this?" he asked, his voice cracking. She didn't answer, letting the words on the screen speak for themselves. Ethan's face paled as realization dawned. The diners craned their necks, whispers erupting. "She owns it?" someone murmured. Ethan's hands trembled. He opened his mouth, but no words came. The notification's glow seemed to shrink him, stripping away his faux authority. Naomi stood slowly, her voice calm but final. "Let's see what your manager thinks." Ethan stumbled backward, knocking a water glass. It shattered, the sound jarring in the silent room. "Ms. Carter, I didn't—" She cut him off with a raised hand. "Now," she said simply. Rachel, the manager, rushed over, her face flushed. Ethan looked to her for support, but she avoided his gaze. "I'll handle this," Rachel said tightly, her voice trembling. Naomi nodded, her posture unyielding as Ethan's world crumbled. Forks froze mid-air. Conversations died. Every eye in the room locked onto Naomi and Ethan. Rachel whispered urgently to Ethan, "You're fired. Leave, now!" He opened his mouth to protest, but the diner's stares silenced him. He walked out, shoulders hunched, his polished shoes echoing hollowly. Naomi sat back down, smoothing her blazer. The clink of silverware resumed, but the air hummed with a new energy. Awareness, shame, and the quiet thrill of justice served. The boutique door jingled faintly as it shut in front of them. 8-year-old Naomi stood outside, her small hand tightly wrapped in her mother's. The clerk inside didn't bother to hide her disdain as she turned the sign to closed, her movements deliberate, dismissive. "We're closing early today," the woman said flatly, her eyes flicking down at Naomi's mother's worn coat before locking the door. Naomi's mother stood still for a moment, her posture straight despite the weight of the moment. "Come on, baby," she said softly, tugging Naomi's hand gently. "But it's not closed," Naomi whispered, looking through the glass at the racks of clothes and the other customers still browsing inside. Her mother didn't answer right away. She just smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Some doors aren't meant to open for us," she murmured, almost to herself. Naomi looked up at her mother, confused but quiet. She didn't understand then, not fully. But she remembered how tightly her mother held her hand that day. How they walked away without looking back. Years later, Naomi sat in a sleek office, a pen poised over a stack of papers. The room was quiet, except for the faint hum of air conditioning and the scratch of the pen as she signed her name. Naomi Carter. She paused for a moment, staring at the final document. Ownership Transfer Agreement. Her reflection stared back at her from the polished table, older now, sharper, but still carrying that little girl's memory of closed doors and silent dismissals. This time, she thought as she set the pen down with deliberate precision, it's mine to change. The boutique incident wasn't the only time Naomi felt the sting of exclusion. Her childhood was marked by moments that quietly etched themselves into her memory. She recalled walking into a restaurant with her mother, their steps hesitant but hopeful. The hostess barely glanced at them before saying, "Members only tonight." Naomi's mother nodded politely, her face unreadable, and turned to leave without protest. At school, Naomi remembered sitting alone in the cafeteria, her tray untouched as subtle glances and whispered conversations surrounded her. "She doesn't fit in here," one girl muttered to another, their laughter soft but cutting. Naomi kept her head down, pretending not to hear. These moments weren't loud or dramatic. They were quiet rejections that spoke volumes. They taught Naomi early on that some spaces weren't designed for people like her, but instead of breaking her, they fueled her resolve. Years later, those memories resurfaced as Naomi stood outside Willowbrook Fine Dining for the first time. The glowing sign above the entrance felt heavy with history, its reputation built on exclusivity and unspoken rules about who was welcome and who wasn't. Naomi didn't walk away this time. She stepped inside, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor. She didn't need anyone's permission to be there, not anymore. Her goal wasn't just to own the space, but to transform it entirely. She wanted Willowbrook to become a place where no one had to wonder if they belonged, a place where doors opened for everyone, not just a select few. Naomi Carter sat in the quiet of her office, the faint hum of the city outside her window. The ownership papers for Willowbrook Fine Dining lay neatly on her desk, their weight far heavier than the stack of pages suggested. She ran her fingers over the bold letters at the top. Ownership Transfer Agreement. She had learned about Willowbrook's history months earlier, its reputation as a haven for exclusivity, catering only to wealthy white patrons. Stories whispered through the community painted a clear picture. This wasn't a place for people like her. Naomi didn't hesitate. She made an offer, anonymously, ensuring no one knew the buyer's identity until every signature was in place. Her goal wasn't just ownership, it was transformation. She didn't want to simply claim the space, she wanted to reshape it. This wasn't about revenge or proving a point. It was about creating something better, something lasting. Naomi thought back to her mother's quiet resilience, how she had walked away from rejection without complaint, but carried its weight silently. Naomi had vowed long ago that she wouldn't just walk away. She would walk through the doors that were once closed to her and leave them open for others. She glanced at the framed photo on her desk, a picture of her younger self holding hands with her mother outside that boutique so many years ago. This is for us, she thought, setting the pen down after signing the final document. The next day, Naomi visited Willowbrook for the first time as its owner. She didn't announce herself or demand recognition. She simply observed, watching how the staff treated their guests, how they treated people who didn't fit. What she saw confirmed everything she already knew. Change was overdue. Ethan Blake adjusted his tie as he stood at the host's stand, scanning the dining room with practiced ease. The evening was running smoothly. Polished silverware gleamed under soft lighting, and the predominantly white clientele chatted over glasses of wine. Everything fit the image of exclusivity Willowbrook Fine Dining prided itself on. Then Naomi Carter walked in. Ethan noticed her immediately. Her tailored blazer and confident stride were undeniable, but something about her presence unsettled him. She didn't fit the image he had come to expect from their guests. His smile tightened as his mind raced to categorize her. "Reservation?" he asked, his tone polite but clipped. "No," Naomi replied evenly, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "Just one for dinner." Ethan hesitated, glancing at the seating chart unnecessarily before looking back at her. She's probably here to make a scene, he thought, dismissing her as someone seeking attention or trying to prove a point. His posture stiffened as he decided how to handle her. "I'm afraid we're fully booked tonight," he said smoothly, his words carrying an edge that wasn't there moments ago. Naomi's eyes flicked toward the half-empty dining room behind him, but she didn't flinch. "Those tables look available," she said calmly, her voice steady and unbothered by his tone. "They're reserved," Ethan replied quickly, leaning forward slightly as if to make his point clearer. Perhaps another establishment would be more suitable. Naomi didn't move or react visibly, her composure unsettling him further. Ethan's assumptions about her race, her purpose for being there, clouded his judgment entirely. He didn't see her quiet power. He only saw what he expected not to belong. Ethan leaned casually against the bar, his polished shoes tapping faintly against the floor as he watched Naomi from across the room. His smirk widened, fueled by the confidence that no one would question his judgment. To him, she was out of place, a disruption in the carefully curated image of Willowbrook Fine Dining. "She's probably here for clout or a viral video," Ethan muttered under his breath to Daniel, a younger waiter standing beside him. Daniel glanced toward Naomi briefly, then looked away, shifting uncomfortably. "I don't know, man," he replied hesitantly. "She seems calm," Ethan scoffed, crossing his arms tightly. "Calm?" he repeated mockingly. "That's what they do, act like they're above it all until they make a scene." Daniel didn't respond. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his silence complicit in Ethan's behavior. Ethan straightened up and grabbed a menu from the counter, holding it loosely in his hand as he walked back toward Naomi's table. His smirk remained firmly in place, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Still waiting?" he asked, his tone laced with mock politeness as he placed the menu down on her table without opening it. Naomi looked up at him slowly, her expression unreadable, but steady. "Yes," she said simply, her calmness cutting through his arrogance like a blade. Ethan's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before returning with forced confidence. He turned sharply on his heel and walked away without another word, leaving Naomi alone once again. Across the room, Daniel watched Ethan return to the bar and toss the menu aside carelessly. "You didn't give it to her?" Daniel asked quietly. "She'll leave eventually," Ethan replied dismissively, though doubt flickered briefly in his eyes. The soft click of Rachel's heels echoed against the marble floor as she approached the host stand. Her face was tight, her movements brisk, the kind of urgency that signaled something had gone terribly wrong. Naomi had called her directly, and Rachel knew better than to delay. "Ethan," she said sharply, pulling him aside. Her voice was low but firm, her fingers gripping his arm just enough to make him pause. "Do you have any idea who she is?" Ethan's brow furrowed briefly before he let out a short, dismissive laugh. "What does it matter?" he replied, shaking her off. "She doesn't belong here." Rachel's lips parted as if to respond, but no words came out. She glanced toward Naomi, who sat calmly at her table, her posture unshaken despite the tension in the room. Rachel's stomach churned as she realized the weight of Ethan's arrogance and what it could cost them. "She owns this place," Rachel whispered finally, her voice barely audible but heavy with meaning. Ethan froze for a moment before scoffing again, though his laugh lacked its earlier confidence. "Impossible," he muttered, shaking his head. "The owner's some investor from out of town." Rachel didn't argue. She just stared at him, her silence louder than any reprimand could have been. Ethan shifted uncomfortably under her gaze, but refused to back down. "She doesn't belong here," he repeated stubbornly, his voice quieter now but no less insistent. Rachel exhaled slowly, releasing his arm and stepping back. "How did we get here?" she thought bitterly as she turned away, leaving Ethan to flounder in his misplaced confidence. Rachel stood frozen near the bar, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. Ethan's dismissive laugh still echoed in her ears, but it wasn't funny anymore. She glanced at Naomi, who remained seated at her table, calm and composed. The quiet confidence in Naomi's posture made Rachel's stomach churn. She didn't need to say anything. She knew the truth now. Naomi owned this place. Rachel's mind raced as the gravity of Ethan's action settled over her like a heavy weight. Her face paled, her lips pressed into a thin line as she replayed the interaction in her head. Ethan's sneer, his arrogance, his refusal to listen. Rachel looked at Ethan again, watching him fumble with the menu he had refused to give. Naomi. He was trying to act like he was in control, but his movements were stiff, his confidence cracking with every passing second. The diners were watching now, their forks paused mid-air as the tension in the room grew heavier. Rachel could feel their eyes on her too, waiting for her to do something, to say something, but she couldn't move. How did we let it get this far? She thought bitterly, her regret bubbling beneath the surface but unable to escape. She had seen moments like this before, small acts of exclusion that went unchecked because no one wanted to confront them. And now it had spiraled into something much bigger than she could contain. Rachel turned away from Ethan, her silence speaking louder than any reprimand could have. She didn't defend him or try to justify his actions. She simply stepped back and let him unravel on his own. The tension in the room was suffocating, pressing down on every table like an invisible weight. Naomi sat quietly at her table, her hands resting lightly on the edge. Ethan hovered nearby, his posture stiff and defensive, his smirk faltering, as the silence stretched longer than he expected. At a corner table, a young woman discreetly raised her phone, angling it toward Ethan and Naomi. The screen lit up, recording the scene unfolding before her. Ethan's voice cut through the uneasy quiet, sharp and condescending. "Policy is policy," he said coldly, his smirk returning as he crossed his arms. If you don't like it, you're free to leave. Naomi didn't flinch. She met his gaze with a quiet intensity that made him shift uncomfortably on his feet. Policy? She repeated softly, her tone measured but firm. Is that what you're hiding behind? Ethan's smirk faltered for a moment before he forced it back into place. I'm not hiding behind anything, he snapped. This isn't personal. The young woman with the phone bit her lip as she zoomed in on Ethan's face, capturing the sneer that accompanied his words. Her fingers hovered over the screen as she typed quickly, "Racism has no place in 2025. With a single tap, the video uploaded to her feed. Within seconds, notifications began to flood in. Comments poured beneath the post. Unbelievable. Fire him. This is everywhere. Across the room, whispers replaced the clinking of glasses. Diners leaned toward one another, their voices hushed but urgent. Ethan's eyes darted around the room as the whispers grew louder. He could feel their judgment pressing against him like a physical force. The clinking of silverware slowed, then stopped entirely. The room buzzed with a different kind of energy now. Low murmurs, hushed whispers, and stolen glances. Naomi sat still at her table, her calm presence radiating a quiet power that unsettled everyone. Across the room, Ethan stood stiffly, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, as though trying to shield himself from the weight of the moment. Did you hear what he said? A man whispered to his companion at a nearby table. The woman nodded, her eyes darting toward Ethan and then back to her plate. Policy? That's just an excuse, she murmured, her voice barely audible. At another table, a young couple leaned closer to each other. Should we say something? One of them asked hesitantly, their fork hovering mid-air. The other shook their head, quickly. It's not our business, they replied quietly, though their discomfort was evident in the way they avoided looking at Naomi or Ethan directly. The tension in the room grew heavier as the whispers spread like ripples in still water. Some diners exchanged knowing glances. Others kept their heads down, pretending not to notice what was happening. But no one spoke up. Ethan could feel their judgment pressing against him like a physical weight. His earlier confidence had all but evaporated, replaced by a gnawing unease he couldn't shake. He glanced toward Rachel for support, but she stood frozen near the bar, her face pale and unreadable. Naomi remained composed, her hands resting lightly on the table as though she were completely unaffected by the growing storm around her. But her silence wasn't passive. It was deliberate, and it spoke louder than any words could have. The video spread like wildfire. Within minutes, the diner's post had gained thousands of views. The caption, "Racism has no place in 2025, struck a chord, igniting outrage across social media. Notifications flooded in, likes, shares, and comments piling up faster than anyone could keep track. This is disgusting. Fire him now. This is systemic racism in action. Naomi remained seated at her table, her posture calm as the storm brewed outside the restaurant's walls. Ethan, however, was anything but composed. He stood frozen near the host stand, his hands trembling slightly as he glanced around the room. The whispers among diners had grown louder, their judgment palpable. Rachel stood near the bar, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She stared at her phone screen as the video popped up on her feed, her stomach sinking as she read the comments. How did we let this happen? She thought bitterly, guilt clawing at her insides. Outside the restaurant, reporters began to gather, their cameras poised and ready. The viral video had turned Willowbrook fine dining into a symbol of everything wrong with exclusionary spaces. The restaurant's name trended alongside hashtags like #justice served and #end-racism. Ethan's face paled as he realized the magnitude of what was happening. He glanced toward Rachel again, desperate for some kind of support, but she didn't meet his gaze. Instead, she turned away, her silence louder than any reprimand could have been. Naomi finally glanced at her phone, watching as the comments rolled in beneath the video. She didn't smile or react visibly. She simply set it down again and folded, her hands neatly on the table. The power had shifted entirely. Rachel stood near the bar, her arms folded tightly across her chest. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line as she watched the scene unfold. The viral video had reached millions within hours, and the whispers among diners had turned into quiet judgment. Ethan stood stiffly near the host stand, his earlier arrogance crumbling under the weight of the stares directed at him. Rachel's phone buzzed in her hand, another notification from social media. She didn't need to open it to know what it said. Comments condemning Ethan's actions, calling for accountability, demanding change. She glanced toward Naomi, who sat calmly at her table, her composure unshaken despite the chaos around her. How did we let this happen? Rachel thought bitterly, guilt clawing at her insides. She had seen moments like this before, small acts of exclusion that went unchecked because no one wanted to confront them. She had let it happen too many times, brushing off complaints, ignoring subtle biases in the name of maintaining standards. Now it was too late. The damage was done, and there was no undoing it. Rachel looked at Ethan again, watching him fumble with the menu he had refused to give Naomi. His hands trembled slightly as he tried to act like he was still in control, but everyone in the room could see through him now. Rachel exhaled slowly and stepped forward, her heels clicking softly against the floor. She didn't defend Ethan or try to justify his actions. She simply met Naomi's gaze and nodded once, a silent acknowledgement of what needed to happen next. The weight of her shame was heavy, but she knew it wasn't enough to fix what had been broken. The room grew quieter, the hum of conversation replaced by an uneasy stillness. Forks rested on plates, glasses remained untouched, and diners exchanged glances that carried more weight than words. Naomi sat at her table, her posture calm and deliberate, her hands resting lightly on the edge. She didn't need to say anything. Her presence alone was enough to shift the atmosphere. Ethan stood near the host stand, his shoulders hunched as though trying to shrink under the weight of the judgment pressing against him. The diners weren't speaking directly to him, but their silence was louder than any confrontation could have been. Rachel lingered near the bar, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She watched the scene unfold with a mix of regret and resignation. The viral video had exposed everything: the systemic biases that had been ignored for years, the quiet complicity of those who chose not to act, and the arrogance of people like Ethan who believed their authority was untouchable. One diner leaned toward their companion and whispered softly, "She's incredible." Another nodded in agreement but said nothing more. The shift wasn't dramatic or loud. It was subtle, like the first cracks in a wall that had stood for too long. Naomi finally glanced around the room, her gaze sweeping across the diners and staff who avoided eye contact but couldn't ignore what was happening. She didn't smile or react visibly. She simply folded her hands neatly on the table and waited. The clinking of silverware resumed faintly in the background, but it wasn't the same. The air felt different now, charged with awareness, discomfort, and the quiet beginnings of change. The room was still, the kind of silence that made every small sound feel amplified. A fork clinked against a plate, a glass was set down too hard, and then the whispers began. "She owns this place?" a man murmured to his companion, his voice low but sharp with disbelief. "How could he not know?" another diner asked, her tone a mix of shock and quiet judgment. The realization spread like wildfire, rippling through the room in waves. Forks hovered mid-air. Glasses paused mid-sip. The diners froze, their conversations forgotten as they pieced together what was happening. Naomi Carter, the woman Ethan had dismissed so easily, wasn't just a guest. She was the owner. Ethan stood near the host stand, his posture stiff and his face pale. He could feel their eyes on him now, the weight of their judgment pressing down on him like a physical force. His earlier confidence had evaporated entirely, replaced by a gnawing unease he couldn't shake. Naomi remained seated at her table, her calm demeanor unshaken despite the growing tension in the room. She didn't need to say anything. Her presence alone was enough to shift the balance of power. Rachel stood near the bar, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as she watched the scene unfold. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line, as she realized just how badly things had spiraled out of control. The whispers grew louder, mingling with the faint hum of ambient jazz and the clinking of silverware that had resumed hesitantly. The room held its breath, waiting for what would happen next. Naomi pushed her chair back slowly, the sound of its legs scraping against the floor cutting through the whispers like a blade. All eyes turned to her as she stood, her posture unyielding, her presence commanding. The room seemed to hold its breath, the faint hum of jazz fading into the background. She didn't rush to speak. Instead, she let the silence settle, her gaze sweeping across the diners who had frozen mid-bite, their forks hovering in the air. She glanced at Ethan briefly, his pale face betraying his crumbling confidence. Then she spoke, her voice calm but firm enough to slice through the tension. Exclusion. "Built these walls," Naomi said evenly, her words carrying across the room without needing to rise above a conversational tone. "Today, we tear them down." Her statement landed like a verdict. The whispers stopped entirely, replaced by stunned silence. A man near the corner table set his glass down carefully, his eyes fixed on Naomi as though seeing her for the first time. Rachel stood near the bar, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as she watched Naomi speak. Her stomach churned with guilt and regret, but she couldn't look away. "How did we let this happen?" she thought bitterly. Ethan shifted uncomfortably near the host stand, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the edge of the podium for support. He opened his mouth to respond, but closed it again when no words came out. Naomi didn't flinch or falter. She remained standing, her presence filling every corner of the room. The diners exchanged glances, their discomfort evident but unspoken. The air felt charged now, heavy with awareness and quiet judgment. Ethan's throat tightened as Naomi's words echoed in the room. "Exclusion built these walls. Today, we tear them down." Her calm, unwavering tone left no room for argument, and yet he felt compelled to respond. He stepped forward slightly, his polished shoes tapping faintly against the marble floor. "I didn't know," he blurted out, his voice cracking under the weight of the moment. The words came out too quickly, too defensively, and hung awkwardly, in the air. He glanced around the room, searching for support among the diners or staff, but found only averted gazes and stiff postures. Naomi didn't move, her gaze steady and piercing. She didn't need to say anything. Her silence was louder than any rebuttal could have been. "I was just following policy," Ethan stammered, his voice trembling now. He gestured toward the seating chart on the podium as though it could somehow justify his actions. It wasn't personal. The diners exchanged glances, their discomfort palpable. A woman near the corner table whispered to her companion, "Policy? That's just an excuse." Her companion nodded silently, their judgment clear in their expressions. Rachel stood frozen near the bar, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as she watched Ethan flounder. She could feel the weight of the diners' stares pressing against her too, their silent condemnation cutting deeper than any words could have. Ethan's hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the podium for support. His earlier confidence had crumbled entirely, replaced by a desperate need to explain himself. But no explanation would suffice now. The room remained silent, except for the faint hum of jazz in the background, its calm melody a stark contrast to Ethan's unraveling. Naomi tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady and unyielding. Ethan's stammered excuses hung in the air, like smoke, suffocating and meaningless. She didn't rush to respond. She let the silence stretch, the weight of her presence filling the room. "You didn't need to know who I am," Naomi said finally, her voice soft but sharp enough to cut through the tension. "Respect isn't a policy. It's a choice." Her words landed like a verdict, heavy and undeniable. Ethan's face flushed as he opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He glanced around the room again, searching for someone, anyone, to defend him, but found only averted gazes and stiff postures. Rachel stood near the bar, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as she watched Ethan crumble. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than any reprimand could have been. The diners exchanged glances, their discomfort palpable but unspoken. A man near the corner table set his glass down carefully, his eyes fixed on Naomi as though seeing her for the first time. Ethan's hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the podium for support. His earlier arrogance had evaporated entirely, replaced by a gnawing unease he couldn't shake. He tried to straighten his posture, to regain some semblance of control, but it was too late. The power had shifted completely. Naomi remained standing, her posture calm and composed despite the chaos around her. She didn't flinch or falter. She simply waited, letting Ethan's silence speak louder than any excuse he could muster. The tension inside the restaurant was palpable, but outside, the world was already erupting. The video, recorded discreetly by a diner, had hit social media just minutes ago. Its caption, "Racism has no place in 2025, was simple but powerful. Within moments, it began to spread like wildfire. The clip showed Ethan's sneer as he said, "Policy is policy," followed by Naomi's calm response, "Respect isn't a policy, it's a choice." The contrast between his arrogance and her quiet dignity struck a chord with viewers everywhere. Notifications flooded in as hashtags. Like hashtag justice served and hashtag end racism began trending globally. Comments poured beneath the video. "This is disgusting. Fire him immediately. This changes everything." Inside the restaurant, Ethan stood stiffly near the host stand, his face pale and his hands trembling. He could feel the judgment pressing against him like a physical weight. The whispers among diners had grown louder, their discomfort turning into quiet condemnation. Rachel stood near the bar, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as she stared at her phone screen. The video had popped up on her feed, and she couldn't look away. Each comment felt like a blow to her gut. How did we let this happen? How many times have we ignored moments like this? Naomi remained seated at her table, her posture calm and composed despite the chaos swirling around her. She glanced briefly at her own phone as notifications rolled in, shares, likes, comments, but she didn't react visibly. Instead, she set it down again and folded her hands neatly on the table. The power had shifted entirely now, and the storm outside was only growing stronger. The quiet chaos inside the restaurant was mirrored by the growing frenzy outside. Reporters had begun to gather, their cameras poised and ready, their voices merging into a chaotic roar. The viral video had turned Willowbrook Fine Dining into the epicenter of a global conversation about racism and privilege. Naomi glanced toward the glass doors, where flashes of light from cameras pierced through the evening gloom. She didn't rush to leave her table. She remained seated, her composure unshaken despite the storm brewing just beyond the threshold. Ethan stood near the host stand, his face pale and his posture rigid. He could hear the muffled shouts of reporters outside, their questions blending into one another. Is it true she owns the restaurant? Will there be legal action? What do you have to say about the video? Rachel lingered near the bar, her phone buzzing incessantly in her hand. She didn't dare open it again. She already knew what awaited her. More comments, more outrage, more calls for accountability. Her stomach churned as she realized how quickly this had spiraled out of control. Naomi finally stood, her movements deliberate and calm. She walked toward the door with measured steps, each click of her heels echoing softly against the marble floor. The diners watched her go, their conversations hushed, and their gazes fixed on her as though they were witnessing something monumental. As Naomi stepped outside, the reporters surged forward, their microphones raised high and their questions overlapping in a chaotic symphony. She paused at the top of the stairs, her posture straight and commanding. She didn't flinch or falter. She simply waited for the noise to settle before speaking. The reporters quieted as Naomi stood at the top of the stairs, her presence commanding without needing to raise her voice. Their microphones hovered inches from her face, their cameras trained on her every movement. The chaos of overlapping questions faded into a tense silence. anticipation hanging heavy in the air. Naomi's gaze swept across the crowd, her expression calm but resolute. She didn't rush to speak. She let the silence linger, her composure filling every moment. When she finally spoke, her words were measured and deliberate, carrying far beyond the microphones and cameras. "This isn't about me," Naomi began, her voice steady but firm enough to cut through the tension. "It's about seeing each other fully, beyond assumptions, beyond stereotypes." Her words rippled through the crowd like a wave. Reporters exchanged glances, their pens poised over, notebooks and their cameras capturing every second. Naomi didn't falter. She continued with quiet authority. "For too long, spaces like this have thrived on exclusion, on people like me being made to feel invisible or unwelcome. That ends today." The reporters erupted again, their questions merging into a chaotic roar. "What changes will you make? Are you pressing charges? What message do you want to send?" Naomi didn't answer immediately. She paused, letting her previous words sink in before delivering her final statement. Justice isn't always about punishment. It's about change. With that, she turned and walked back inside the restaurant, leaving the reporters stunned and scrambling to capture every detail of what had just unfolded. Her words echoed far beyond the room, into millions of screens, conversations, and hearts. Inside the restaurant, the atmosphere was heavy with tension. Naomi's words still hung in the air, their echo lingering long after she had stepped back. Inside, the staff stood frozen, exchanging glances that carried more weight than words. Waiters adjusted their ties nervously. Chefs peeked out from the kitchen, and the busboy lingered near the corner, unsure of where to go. Ethan remained near the host's stand, his hands gripping the edge of the podium as though it might anchor him against the storm brewing around him. His earlier arrogance had crumbled entirely, replaced by a gnawing unease he couldn't hide. He looked toward Rachel for support, but she didn't meet his gaze. Rachel stood near the bar, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as she stared at Naomi from across the room. Her face was etched with regret, her lips pressed into a thin line as her thoughts raced. "How did we let this happen?" she wondered bitterly. "How many moments like this have we ignored?" The staff's loyalty was shifting now, not toward Ethan or even Rachel, but toward Naomi. Her quiet dignity had exposed everything, the systemic biases that had been ignored for years, the arrogance of those who believed their authority was untouchable, and the complicity of those who chose silence over action. Naomi didn't need to say anything. Her presence alone was enough to shift the dynamics of the room. She sat back at her table, her posture calm and composed, despite the chaos swirling around her. The staff watched her silently, their judgment clear in their expressions. Ethan remained isolated, his confidence shattered and his future uncertain. The room remained still, the tension thick and unyielding. Naomi sat at her table, her hands resting lightly on the edge, her gaze steady but calm. The staff lingered near the corners of the room, their movements hesitant as though afraid to disrupt the charged silence. Ethan stood frozen by the host stand, his grip on the podium tightening as he avoided everyone's gaze. Then, slowly, the clink of silverware began to return. A fork scraped against a plate. A glass was lifted and set down gently. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, but they were different now, softer, more deliberate. The unspoken elitism that had once filled the air seemed to fracture under the weight of what had just unfolded. At one table, a man leaned toward his companion and whispered, "I didn't know she owned this place." His companion nodded silently, their expression thoughtful but uneasy. Rachel stood near the bar, her arms still crossed tightly over her chest. She watched as Naomi sat back in her chair, composed and unbothered by the murmurs around her. Rachel's regret deepened with every passing second. "This isn't just about Ethan," she thought bitterly. "It's about all of us." Ethan remained rooted in place, his face pale and his posture stiff. He glanced toward Rachel again, hoping for some kind of intervention, but she didn't move or speak. The staff avoided him entirely now, their loyalty shifting fully toward Naomi. The clinking grew louder as more diners returned to their meals, but the air felt different, charged with awareness and quiet judgment. Naomi didn't need to say anything else. Her presence alone had already changed everything. Outside the restaurant, the storm of social media continued to grow. The video of Ethan's sneer and Naomi's calm response had reached millions within hours. Hashtags like #JusticeServed, #EndRacism, and #OpenTheDoors began trending globally, igniting conversations far beyond the walls of Willowbrook Fine Dining. A tweet from a diner who had witnessed the scene firsthand went viral. "Privilege isn't power, it's a mask. Naomi Carter just tore it off." The post was shared tens of thousands of times, accompanied by screenshots from the video and captions demanding accountability. Inside the restaurant, Naomi remained seated at her table, her posture steady as ever. She glanced briefly at her phone, watching as notifications scrolled across her screen, comments, likes, shares, but she didn't react visibly. This wasn't about her, it was about something much bigger. Rachel stood near the bar, her phone buzzing incessantly in her hand. She hesitated before opening it, bracing herself for what she already knew was there. Endless messages condemning the restaurant's history of exclusion and Ethan's actions that night. "This place needs to change," one comment read. "It's time." Ethan stood near the host stand, his face pale and his hands trembling as he stared blankly at his own phone screen. The comments beneath the video were relentless. "Fire him now. This is what systemic racism looks like. Do better." The restaurant's name trended alongside calls for systemic change. Willowbrook Fine Dining had become more than a symbol of exclusivity. It was now a battleground for justice and accountability. Naomi didn't need to speak again. Her actions had already sparked a movement that couldn't be ignored. The room was silent, the weight of judgment pressing down on everyone present. Ethan stood near the host stand, his posture stiff and his hands trembling as he tried to hold on to the last remnants of his confidence. Rachel stepped forward, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor, each step deliberate and heavy with purpose. She stopped just a few feet away from Ethan, her face pale but resolute. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke. "You're done here." Ethan's eyes widened in disbelief. "What?" he stammered, his voice cracking as he glanced around the room for support. The diners avoided his gaze, their silence louder than any words could have been. "I didn't mean—" Ethan began, but Rachel cut him off sharply. "Enough." Her tone left no room for argument. Naomi remained seated at her table, her gaze steady and unflinching. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Her quiet presence was enough to drown out Ethan's protests entirely. Rachel's hands clenched tightly at her sides as she continued, "Leave now." Ethan hesitated for a moment, his mind racing as he tried to find a way out of this. But there was none. He glanced at Naomi one last time, hoping for some kind of reprieve, but her calm expression offered nothing. Not anger, not pity, just quiet certainty. Defeated, Ethan turned and walked toward the door, his shoulders hunched and his polished shoes echoing hollowly against the floor. The diners watched him go, their judgment clear in their expressions but unspoken in their words. Rachel exhaled slowly, her regret heavy but her resolve unshaken. Naomi's gaze followed Ethan until the door closed behind him. Ethan sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, the glow of his phone screen casting shadows across his face. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional buzz of notifications. He hesitated before opening the social media app, his thumb hovering over the screen as dread settled in his chest. The viral video was everywhere. He couldn't escape it. The caption, "Racism has no place in 2025, was etched into his mind, replaying alongside Naomi's calm response, "Respect isn't a policy. It's a choice." Ethan pressed play on the clip for what felt like the 100th time, watching himself sneer and dismiss her with arrogance he could barely recognize now. The comments beneath the video were relentless. "Fire him immediately. This is what systemic racism looks like. Unbelievable. People like him are the problem. Ethan scrolled further, hoping to find something, anything that defended him, but there was nothing. Each comment felt like a blow, cutting deeper than the last. His hands trembled as he set the phone down on the table, but his curiosity pulled him back to it moments later. He opened his messages, hoping for support from friends or colleagues, but instead found silence. No one had reached out, not even Rachel. He stared at the empty inbox, the weight of isolation pressing down on him like a physical force. Ethan leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair as regret clawed at him. He had thought he was untouchable, that his actions would go unnoticed or unchallenged. But now, he couldn't escape the judgment. Not from the world, not from himself. Weeks had passed, but the viral video hadn't faded. Ethan sat at his desk, staring at his laptop screen, the cursor blinking on yet another job application form. His hands hovered over the keyboard, hesitant, as though he already knew how this would end. He had applied to every restaurant he could think of, small diners, chain establishments, even catering companies. Each time the response was the same, polite rejection or complete silence. His reputation preceded him now, and no amount of carefully worded cover letters could erase what millions of people had seen online. Ethan clicked Submit on another application and leaned back in his chair, exhaling heavily. Moments later, his phone buzzed with an email notification. He opened it quickly, hoping for something different this time. Thank you for your interest. Unfortunately, we are unable to move forward with your application at this time. The words blurred as Ethan stared at them, his chest tightening with frustration and shame. He tossed his phone onto the desk and buried his face in his hands. The weight of his actions was sinking in now. Doors that had once opened easily for him were slamming shut one after another. He thought back to Naomi's calm words. Respect isn't a policy, it's a choice. They echoed in his mind like a haunting reminder of everything he had ignored and dismissed. Ethan glanced at the stack of rejection emails piling up in his inbox and felt the sting of isolation all over. Again, he had always believed his privilege would shield him from consequences. But now he was facing them head-on, and there was nowhere left to hide. The restaurant was different now. Under Naomi's leadership, Willowbrook Fine Dining had begun to shed the exclusivity it once prided itself on. The subtle elitism that had defined its atmosphere was replaced by a quiet sense of welcome. It wasn't loud or flashy. The changes were deliberate, thoughtful, and rooted in inclusion. Naomi had started with the staff. She hired people from diverse backgrounds, ensuring the team reflected the community it served. The once homogeneous group of waiters and chefs was now a mosaic of experiences and perspectives. Each new hire brought something unique to the space: warmth, authenticity, and a shared commitment to change. Community events followed. Willowbrook opened its doors to host fundraisers for local organizations, art showcases for underrepresented artists, and food drives for those in need. The restaurant wasn't just a place to dine anymore, it was becoming a hub for connection and growth. The menu changed, too. Naomi worked with her chefs to incorporate dishes inspired by cultures from around the world, celebrating diversity through e-food. Guests who had once felt out of place now found themselves represented in the flavors and stories behind each dish. The transformation wasn't immediate. It took time and effort, but Naomi never wavered in her vision. She walked through the dining room often, observing quietly as families laughed together, friends shared meals, and staff moved seamlessly between tables with genuine smiles. The whispers of judgment that had once filled the air were gone, replaced by conversations that flowed freely without fear or exclusion. Willowbrook was no longer just a restaurant. It was becoming a symbol of what could happen when spaces were reclaimed and reimagined for everyone. The walls of Willowbrook Fine Dining had transformed into a gallery of stories. Naomi had invited local Black artists to adorn the space with their work, paintings, photographs, and sculptures that spoke of resilience, history, and hope. Each piece carried its own voice, telling truths that had long been ignored in spaces like this. A large painting near the entrance caught every guest's As they walked in. It depicted a young black girl standing outside a boutique, her hand tightly gripping her mother's as the closed sign hung in the window. The brushstrokes were raw, the emotion palpable. Naomi paused in front of it often, remembering her own childhood and the moments that had shaped her journey. In the dining room, vibrant portraits of black families laughing together lined the walls. A photograph of a chef plating food with precision hung near the kitchen, a tribute to the culinary talent that had often been overlooked in elite spaces like Willowbrook. Guests lingered near the artwork as they waited for their tables, their conversations quieter now, more reflective. A woman traced her fingers along the edge of a painting and murmured to her companion, "It's beautiful and powerful." The art didn't just decorate the space, it shifted its atmosphere entirely. It demanded attention, sparking conversations about identity, history, and belonging. For many diners, it was their first time engaging with these stories so openly, and they couldn't ignore them. Naomi watched from her corner table as guests admired the pieces, their expressions thoughtful and sometimes emotional. The art wasn't just for decoration. It was a reminder of why Willowbrook existed now, to celebrate voices that had been silenced and ensure they were never forgotten again. Willowbrook. Fine dining had become something new. The exclusivity that once defined it had dissolved, replaced by an atmosphere of warmth and belonging. Naomi's vision was clear. This wasn't just a restaurant anymore, it was a space where everyone could feel welcome. Families now filled the dining room, their laughter ringing out as children shared bites of dessert. A group of friends toasted, at a corner table, their glasses raised high in celebration. Couples leaned in close, their conversations flowing freely without judgment or hesitation. The air buzzed with life, the kind of energy that came from genuine connection. The staff moved seamlessly between tables, their smiles genuine and their interactions thoughtful. Naomi had built a team that reflected the diversity of the community, mosaic of backgrounds and experiences working together with shared purpose. Guests who had once felt out of place now found themselves represented not just in the menu, but in the people serving them. The menu itself told stories through food. Dishes inspired by cultures from around the world celebrated flavors that had long been overlooked in elite spaces like Willowbrook. A diner paused as they tasted a dish for the first time, murmuring to their companion, "It's like home." Naomi watched from her corner table, her gaze sweeping across the room. The whispers of judgment that had once filled this space were gone, replaced by conversations that flowed freely without fear or exclusion. This was what she had envisioned, a place where no one had to wonder if they belonged, where every table felt open and inviting. Willowbrook wasn't just a restaurant anymore, it was a symbol of what could happen when spaces were reclaimed and reimagined for everyone. Rachel stood near the bar, her arms folded tightly across her chest as she watched the dining room hum with new life. The transformation of Willowbrook. Fine dining was undeniable. Families laughing, friends toasting, and staff moving seamlessly between tables with genuine smiles. The atmosphere was warm, inviting, and alive in a way it had never been before. But Rachel couldn't shake the weight in her chest. She had been part of the old Willowbrook, the one that thrived on exclusivity, the one that quietly turned people away without question. She had seen moments like Naomi's before, small acts of exclusion disguised as professionalism. But she had ignored them. She had let them happen. Her gaze lingered on Naomi, who sat at her favorite corner table, her posture calm and composed as she observed the room. Rachel felt a pang of guilt every time she looked at her. How did we let it get this far? She wondered, silently. How many people did we turn away without even realizing what we were doing? Rachel's regret was heavy, but it wasn't paralyzing. It was a reminder, a call to do better. She had stayed on as manager under Naomi's leadership, not because she deserved to, but because she wanted to be part of the change. She wanted to help rebuild what had been broken. As Rachel watched a waiter laugh with a guest and a child tug at their parent's sleeve for another bite of dessert, she felt something shift inside her. a quiet resolve to ensure Willowbrook never returned to what it once was. The guilt would always be there, but so would the opportunity to make things right. Naomi sat at her favorite corner table, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the polished wood. The restaurant buzzed around her, families laughing, glasses clinking, and conversations flowing freely. She watched it all quietly, her gaze sweeping across the room as if she were taking inventory of every moment. This was what she had envisioned when she first signed the ownership papers. Willowbrook Fine Dining wasn't just a restaurant anymore. It was a space reclaimed, reimagined, and rebuilt to welcome everyone. The exclusivity that once defined it had been replaced by connection, warmth, and belonging. Naomi's thoughts drifted back to the boutique from her childhood. She could still feel her mother's hand gripping hers tightly as the clerk flipped the sign to closed. She remembered the sting of rejection, the quiet pain of being turned away without explanation. Those moments had shaped her, fueling her determination to create spaces where no one had to wonder if they belonged. Her gaze settled on a young black couple seated near the window. They laughed softly as they shared dessert, their joy unrestrained and unbothered by the world outside. Naomi smiled faintly, knowing how much it meant for them to feel at ease in a space like this. Rachel passed by Naomi's table, pausing briefly to meet her gaze. There was no need for words. The shared understanding between them was enough. Rachel gave a small nod before continuing toward the bar, her movements deliberate and purposeful. Naomi leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly as pride and determination swirled within her. The journey wasn't over. There was still so much work to be done. But tonight, Willowbrook felt like a victory. The restaurant hummed softly, its new life evident in every corner. Naomi sat at her corner table, her gaze steady as she observed the room. Families laughed together, friends toasted, and staff moved seamlessly between tables with warmth and authenticity. Willowbrook Fine Dining had become what she had always envisioned, a space where everyone felt welcome. But Naomi knew this transformation wasn't just about Willowbrook. It was about something bigger. Her thoughts drifted to the countless spaces, like this one, restaurants, boutiques, offices, where exclusion was masked as professionalism, where people were turned away without question or consequence. Change didn't happen overnight, but it had to start somewhere. Her gaze shifted to Rachel, who stood near the bar watching the dining room with quiet reflection. Naomi could see the regret in her posture, the weight of past complicity etched into her expression. But she also saw resolve, a determination to do better, to ensure Willowbrook never returned to what it once was. A waiter passed by Naomi's table, pausing briefly to refill her glass of water. "Everything okay tonight, Miss Carter?" he asked with a genuine smile. Naomi nodded, her own smile faint but sincere. "It's perfect," she replied softly. Her thoughts turned inward as she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From being turned away as a child to owning a space like this, she remembered her mother's quiet resilience and the promise she had made to herself, "I'll walk through the doors they closed on us." Naomi leaned forward slightly, her hands resting lightly on the table as one final thought echoed in her mind. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts when we stop accepting silence as an answer. And with that, Willowbrook hummed with new purpose. The transformation of Willowbrook Fine Dining didn't end within its walls. Naomi's vision had sparked something far greater, a ripple effect that began to spread throughout the community. Businesses that had once operated on exclusivity started reevaluating their policies. Conversations about inclusion and systemic racism grew louder, no longer confined to whispers or fleeting moments of discomfort. Naomi watched it unfold quietly. Her presence felt even when she wasn't in the room. Local boutiques began hosting diversity workshops. Cafes displayed art from underrepresented artists. A nearby bookstore started a monthly series featuring Black authors and creators. Willowbrook had become more than a restaurant. It was a catalyst for change. Rachel stood near the bar one evening, her gaze sweeping across the bustling dining room. She noticed how effortlessly the staff worked together, how guests of all backgrounds filled the space with laughter and warmth. Her regret lingered, but so did her pride in what Willowbrook had become. We did this, she thought silently, her resolve to continue growing stronger with each passing day. Naomi sat at her favorite corner table, her hands resting lightly on the edge as she observed the room. She didn't need recognition or applause. Seeing the space alive with connection was enough. Her thoughts drifted to the future, to the doors yet to be opened, and the spaces yet to be reclaimed. The story of Willowbrook wasn't just about one restaurant. It was about the possibility of change, about what could happen when silence was broken and voices were heard. Naomi's vision left an indelible mark, not just on Willowbrook but on the community itself. A lasting echo that reminded everyone, change starts with us. And with that, Willowbrook continued to hum with purpose.